Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to today's Lifelong Learning Lecture. Our speaker today is Clay Eals. And today Clay is talking about West Seattle. We know Clay as a co-writer of the Sunday Seattle Times, Now and Then photo history column. But Clay has many talents, one of which is a historian. He's the former director of the West Seattle Historical Society, and you may have seen him in the news in September because he was a recipient of the 2023 Seattle Historical Society Preservation Champion Award, which in that circle is a very big deal. Clay is well qualified to tell us about West Seattle. He's a longtime resident of Seattle and is past editor of the West Seattle Herald. Please welcome Clay Eals.
Well, this will be fun today. I like to say I can do this in my sleep. I've been in West Seattle so long. You know, history is something that generally people start to get interested in, truly interested in their 50s, 60s, 70s, you know. But somehow I got into it much earlier than that. And so, in some respects, I'm the only one standing still in West Seattle to talk about some of the things we did long ago, and you know, it's been fun to be able to feel like you have. I guess there's a phrase out there where you know the lay of the land. Well, that's what I kind of feel like in West Seattle. I don't think I could do this kind of a talk about another neighborhood in Seattle as well as I can in this one. And first I wanted to just go very quickly through the fact that how I'm known today is, as Mike said, I'm the Now and Then columnist for the West Seattle, or for the for the Seattle Times. And it comes out, the column comes out every Sunday in the magazine, as you know. And I do it with Jean Sherrard. Jean and I have been doing this for the last 5 years, it's about now. And we took over from a guy named Paul Dorpat, who did it for 37 years. He's now in retirement, and we're just quite grateful to be able to carry on his legacy. And so I just I'm going to start this by pointing out something that got me going on this really early. I became editor of the West Seattle Herald back in 1983. That sounds like Middle Earth these days, you know. That's more than 40 years ago. And what was going on in West Seattle in 1983? What was the big deal? So I heard several people say the bridge. And boy, that was a big, big deal for us to cover that. And this is back when the Herald was a real newspaper, and you know, no internet, and we had to cover that bridge like a glove. And so we did a special section called Bridging the Gap about the opening of the bridge, you'll see here. And that was in '84. That was 104 pages. And that kind of led to this, which is called West Side Story. Here's, you can see how big it is here. It was 288 pages. And for us, you know, with a news staff of 5, to do a history book in 1 year's time and still put out the paper is still a major miracle as far as I'm concerned. I say it's the most exhilarating and exhausting year of my life. And at that time, I was just 35 years old. And at that time, the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, which Mike mentioned, had just started up. And So this sort of became my baby. I didn't write the whole thing, but somebody had to drive the bus. And so this, more than anything, tangibly got me into West Seattle history. But as you all know, it always goes deeper than that and earlier than that. And I have to say, and before before I leave this topic, you'll notice it's called West Side Story. Why isn't it called the West Seattle Story or the West Seattle? And we decided to call it West Side Story because we were covering an area of Seattle that was not only West Seattle but White Center. So we had to come up with a name that covered both of those communities. White Center straddles the southern border of Seattle on Roxbury Street. And besides, I always told people that we were known as Seattle's West Side long before Leonard Bernstein was born, okay? Now, I was fascinated. Jim, can you raise your hand? I'm going to put you on, just raise your hand here in the front row. I just met Jim about 20 minutes ago. He's been at Mirabella a week. He's been in Seattle for a week. He comes from California. I sure hope you all greet him warmly, but he's a great example. I mean, imagine you're someplace for a week. Would you come to an event the first week you're in Seattle? I bow down to you. And I really believe that it doesn't matter if you've lived here for a week or you've lived here for 50, 60, 70 years, your whole lifeline time. It doesn't matter how long you're here. We all have a yearning to be connected to our home, to feel embedded. The more we know about where we live and the history of where we live, the more we just, it fuels our identity and it makes us a happier person, you know? So in that regard, that's my mom in the front. She had 3 sisters. There were 4 sisters in her family. And she was born and raised in West Seattle. And so when I was a kid, and I have to whisper this around here sometimes to say I didn't grow up in West Seattle. I grew up on Mercer Island. You know, I was born in Seattle. We lived up near Wedgwood Rock for 3 years, but then my parents moved us to the first ring suburb of Mercer Island, which at that time was not what it is today. It was a bunch of 3-bedroom ramblers. I mean, it was totally different from what people's impressions are from today. But even growing up there, I was going over to West Seattle all the time because my mom would take us to visit my grandparents there, her parents. And so I became very fascinated with West Seattle. This is just a few blocks from the house that she moved to, her family moved to, and this is my mom at age 6 and her sister Betty in 1929. And you might wonder, what's the top hat about? These are 2 girls. They did a man and woman act. They danced the moonwalk on the stage of the Portola Theater in the Admiral area. And we'll get to that. The Portola is the predecessor of the Admiral Theater. This is my mom as a late teenager, and she's walking Alki Beach. This is, you know, this is something that kids did then. She thought that this was unusual at the time, that her mom would just let her go for a whole day and not even know or care where she went. And so from where she lived, right across the street from Hiawatha Playfield, and we'll get to that, she would walk down Fairmount Gulch, walk all the way around Duwamish Head, if those of you know your geography, and then go out to where the lighthouse is and down Beach Drive and all the way to Lincoln Park and then back to the junction, which we'll get to, in a day. And she loved doing that, and her mom didn't know or care where she was. This is her mom and dad when she's in her 20s, at the family house. And you know, these are the grandparents that I was going to visit all those times when I was a kid. And I fell in love with West Seattle from those visits. You know, the crooked sidewalks, I mean, there's nothing my grandmother wanted to do more than to take us down to Alki Beach and get spud fish and chips and let us run around in the water. And then you get to go to Schmitz Park, you go to Husky Deli, and you're in. I mean, all the rest of my two brothers decided that they would, when they grew up and left home, they moved to the east side. One went to Redmond, one went to Duval. And even my parents moved away from Mercer Island. They went to Issaquah, but not me. I wanted to go to West Seattle. This is an example of the now and then column that I do, and occasionally I try to invoke my own history in the column because I feel like that it's a way for people to relate personally. The more you know about one person, the more you can say, well, that's like me, or that's not quite like me. And this is the family home. And what triggered this column, this installment, was the fact that it was for sale, and only in these 100 years, it had had only 3 owners. My grandparents built it, and then in the late 50s they sold it, and then it was sold in the early 80s, and now it's being sold again to a family from Silicon Valley, California. And the price difference is astounding. Your jaw would drop. So, I mentioned Hiawatha Playfield. This is another recent column. And just to reinforce, if those of you who didn't come to the previous talks I've done, the formula for now and then is to take an old photo and compare it with a photo now from the same vantage point so that you can see what's changed and what's the same. Well, that's a photo from more than 100 years ago, about 110 years ago, looking toward Hiawatha Park. It's a kind of a square-shaped park, and where the photo is taken from is the old West Seattle Central School. It was called the Castle, and it's looking southeast, and you can see most of the park is sort of cleared off, but it still has many of the early trees that were allowed to grow. And then look down in the lower middle, you can see it's much more filled in, but it's still one of the most gorgeous parks in Seattle. And this was where my mom grew up, right across. And this is in the Admiral area. We're going to get to that. Now, I like to say we stand on the shoulders of giants. And my parents, certainly in my life, were, but all of us here who have any connection to Seattle, this is the namesake of Seattle. Seattle is kind of an, what do you call it? It's not the exact, if you were to pronounce his name in the Chinook jargon, it would be something like Sielf. But people couldn't really say that, and it kind of bowdlerized, that's the word I was looking for, became the word Seattle. And this is the person who welcomed the settlers when they came to Alki Beach in 1851. And the legacy keeps on today, and you probably read, there's no little controversy today because the Duwamish tribe is not recognized by the federal government, and they keep seeking recognition, and the other tribes fight it because they don't want to give away a piece of the financial pie. That's what it really comes down to. But there is a Duwamish tribe, there is a Duwamish longhouse, and I just love this quote. This comes from Chief Seattle's grave. He was the chief of both the Duwamish and the Suquamish tribes. The Suquamish grave site for Chief Seattle, you go on the Bainbridge Ferry and you can go see it yourself. But this quote is very inspiring. It's about how, you know, the Duwamish feel that they live on, and we all do in a sense. Even the rocks thrill with memories of past events. The very dust beneath your feet responds more lovingly to our footsteps. The soil is rich with the life of our kindred because it is the ashes of our ancestors. And you've got a statue of the chief just a few blocks down the road here, right off Denny Way. They call it the Denny Triangle. And this is during the Women's March a few years back. But he's presiding over the marchers. If you want to get to know more about Chief Seattle, there's only one book that's got the best of it all, and that's this one by David Berge. He's been a long-time historian here. This came out about 2-3 years ago, and at the Historical Society, we've had him as a speaker several times, going back into the 80s. And as I said, there's a log house. This is down along West Marginal Way. And this is something that's really a great place to visit and get not only a sense of the history of the Duwamish tribe in West Seattle, but to see some gorgeous pieces of art. And the building itself is a gorgeous piece of art. Please put this in your bank about, you know, when you want to go on a field trip of some sort. Come on, as people say. You know, I got to tell you, people never say, you live over in West Seattle. They always say, you live way over in West Seattle. It's because it's a peninsula. And this comes from our history book, The West Side Story. This is just to give you an idea. Just like we have neighborhoods today, these were the native settlements on the Duwamish Peninsula. Now, I know there are people in this room who have not been to West Seattle very much. And that's okay. And then some people know it like the back of their hand, so to speak. But what I want you all to do right now is to learn a very simple way where you can be the expert and show other people who may be from out of town, relatives who come visit or whatever. You can show them how to figure out where West Seattle is, or what in the heck is West Seattle. I want you to take your right hand, put it up in front of your face, and I want you to look at the back of your hand. And the rest of your hand is the rest of Seattle. West Seattle is the thumb. Got it? Some people call this the reverse Michigan. But this is a way to kind of get in your mind, what is West Seattle? And, you know, for many years, West Seattle was kind of a poor cousin. There are times when newspapers would write about the best things to do in Seattle, or they would run a map of where to go in Seattle, and they would cut off the thumb. It would just be the rest of Seattle. And so, you know, one of my favorite phrases is, West Seattle is the best Seattle, right? And my wife says, don't say that, more people are going to come here. And so this is a map of West Seattle in a way that you can understand. It's not so detailed, but this is the thumb. This is the peninsula that I've been talking about. And you can see some of the parks, and you can see the major intersections. We're going to get to, do you see even right in the middle where there's a intersection with Alaska Street and California Avenue? That is called the junction. And somebody in this room about a half hour ago said, what's a junction? Well, I'm going to get to that so that you can know a little more about West Seattle. Now, I'm going to take this map and show you how sometimes the identity of West Seattle has been kind of messed up over the years. You would think it would be easy, but not. You know, downtown is to the right of this map, and what's separating it is the Duwamish River, the only river we have in Seattle, by the way. So, with this Chamber of Commerce map, it's not this way anymore, but in the late 80s and in the 1990s and into the 2000s, before Ed Murray, as mayor, abolished the neighborhood district councils, he divided, the city government divided the city into districts so that each one would have a neighborhood district that you could go to a council and raise your concerns, and then that council could communicate to the city as a whole. But the trouble is, they divided West Seattle into two districts, and they called the rest of West Seattle, and then you can see the blue area here is Delridge. Well, Delridge is just a part of West Seattle, just like Admiral or Fauntleroy or whatever, you know, so it's kind of crazy. Here's how it was even crazier. Mike mentioned that I was the editor of the West Seattle Herald, and I mentioned that I also was in charge of the White Center News. Well, newspapers have different boundaries than government units. And this is a kind of a strange thing. If you look at the red area, anybody who lived in that area in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, who took the newspaper and they would not get the West Seattle Herald, they would get the White Center News. And why is that? Why did it straddle the southern boundary? It's because it was shopping patterns, and the advertisements in the paper could appeal to the people in that area. And have you heard of the phrase a food desert? Well, in many ways, White Center is a food desert north of Roxbury. And so those people who are within the city limits and really in West Seattle would go down to White Center just south of Roxbury to go to a Safeway or go to other grocery stores there. And so that's why that was that way. And so trying to be a newspaper and cover 2 city councils, 2 school boards, anyway, it was nuts. And then there's just the fact that there didn't used to be a West Seattle. It was unincorporated until 1902. And comes from our history book. It's that triangular shaped area at the top, the very Admiral area and down along the beach. You have to remember that the earliest settlements in Seattle as a whole, but certainly in West Seattle, were along the water. And so this is where the city of West Seattle began. We had our own city. And then it annexed that little square area in 1904, and then quickly annexed the rest of it all the way down to Roxbury. And then that whole chunk was annexed into the city of Seattle in 1907. Just like Ballard was annexed into Seattle. That was a big annexation year. So given this, you know, given how sprawling West Seattle is, where do you put a Welcome to West Seattle sign? And this was a now and then about the West Seattle welcome sign that went up in the mid-1980s. And it deteriorated over time, and then there was a new one. So we went from then to now. In fact, the guy on the shortest guy on the right side of the old photo, his name is Earl Cruzen. He was a major civic activist in West Seattle over the years. And he died, and his widow, Ada Cruzen, who's featured in the bottom photo, contributed a significant amount of money to get the new sign put up, and you can still see it today. It's on what's called the Fauntleroy Expressway, where you go up the hill and head toward the junction after you cross the West Seattle Bridge. Ada said she donated the money because Earl left me a few extra zeros. So, how many know who Emma Watson was? Okay, we got a fair number in here. Emma Watson was our preeminent newspaper columnist. He worked for the Seattle Star, he worked for the Seattle PI, worked for the Seattle Times. And he's gone now, but he was, you know, I mean, for 20th century newspaper columnist, he's the man in Seattle as a whole. And he grew up in West Seattle. Had a special connection to it, and I had several occasions to interview him before he died. And his famous quote is, "I have never known anyone who moved to West Seattle for the sheer status of it, only because they liked it." And that's kind of like what my mom would tell me. She would say, every other house in West Seattle has a view because it's so hilly. And if it's not of the water or the Cascades or the Olympics, it's a territorial view that's just as beautiful. I look at Emmett's face there. This is a caricature of him, of course. And I remember my mom reading the PI when I was a little kid. She'd look at the paper and she'd say, "That old reprobate," because he would hang out in bars to get his story ideas downtown. But this is what Emmett told me about West Seattle. It was always sort of a city in itself. See, when I grew up, I had the streetcar, just like everybody remembers, and it was a fair task to go to downtown or the U District. You had to ride that thing in those trestles, and it would take you 45 minutes to get downtown, and another 40 minutes to get to the U District. I used to do that when I went to college. It was a bit of an isolation, and I'm convinced there are many, many families who grew up in West Seattle and never left. Never went to any other part of the city. And I think he's right on about that. And why is that? Well, I would argue transportation is the main theme about West Seattle. And transportation really is fundamental to our life, if you think about it. If we don't transport, I mean, we walk. You guys came here, you walked today. We go in a car, we go in mass transit, we bicycle, whatever. But if we don't transport ourselves throughout the day, if we just stand still like this, we just die. You know, transportation really is it. And if you think about that metaphor of the hand and the thumb, how do you get from the hand to the thumb and back? One of the things that made West Seattle history so fascinating to delve into is that we had the very first ferry boat on Puget Sound. It was called the City of Seattle. This is from our history book. In fact, this photo came from Paul Dorpat, our column predecessor, by the way. But you can see people walked on it. It also would carry livestock. This went from downtown to the foot of, you guessed it, Ferry Avenue in West Seattle. And it took only 5 minutes, or it took only 8 minutes. It was an 8-minute ride. And I don't think anybody's ever beat the ferry since. To go from downtown to that part of West Seattle, even in a car, it's not possible. Now, we also had other ferries in West Seattle. There was an Alki to Manchester ferry, and that's the old photo at the top of this now and then. And I did the now photo of Phil Hoffman, who's a historian here, who is very glad that the ferry shut down early in the 20th century. It died mid-century, because what would have become of Alki Beach if there were a ferry there? He says there'd be a 6-lane highway. There'd be anyway. That's a story for another day. But transportation really is it. Now, we dug up a lot of old newspapers. The West Seattle Herald started in 1923, but we called the group of papers that existed beforehand the pre-Heralds. And there were about 30 or 40 copies we came up with. And the earliest one was called the West Seattle Gazette, and that's from 1890. And this was the same year as the photo of the ferry I showed you. And the purpose, I mean, it's inflated circulation. Look up in the upper left, it says circulation 10,000 copies. I mean, maybe there were 10,000 ladybugs in West Seattle, but there was no way there were anything close to 10,000 people in West Seattle. But its purpose was to promote the West Seattle ferry. Now, you know, putting in a ferry was not just it was a private thing for one thing. It was not public like our ferries today. And it was not some goodwill altruistic gesture. The company called the West Seattle Land and Improvement Company that operated in downtown Seattle put in the ferry because they wanted to sell land in West Seattle. And so they figured for 5 cents you'd get across on the ferry. That was cheap even then, to lure you across to West Seattle. And then they put in a free cable car that went up Ferry Avenue and around what we now know the Admiral area today and come back down. And that way you got to see land, and you can see right here, you could buy a lot for $200. Can you imagine? Huh. Anyway, so transportation was fundamental to that whole thing. And of course, the ferries the ferry led to a second ferry later on. But what really helped West Seattle take off in its development, and if you go drive through West Seattle, you can see the oldest houses are in the north end, and as you get further south, they get more modern. You know, I didn't even know they had a slogan for this, mid-century modern, for where I grew up when I was a kid. But anyway, this is a map from our history book that shows the streetcar lines. And there were 4 of them. The first one is in red, and you can see it's coming up from the foot of Ferry Avenue there, up at the very top of the map, and it comes up around California, which for decades, California Avenue, that's that long stretch. For decades, that was known as the longest straight street in Seattle. But it got eclipsed when down in the lower bottom left corner, that little triangle, Arbor Heights, was annexed to Seattle. And so 35th became a little longer than California. But California was the main drag. So you can see the red coming down, and then the dotted lines where it was extended and then extended. And by the time it was extended to Alaska Street, you can see where Alaska is there? There's another streetcar coming up, the blue one, that comes over to meet it. And where the 2 streetcar lines met was the junction of the streetcar lines. Hence, starting in 1907, we had a business district that called itself the Junction. Now, I've been reminded here today, there are several junctions in West Seattle, sure. There's the Admiral Junction, there's the Morgan Street Junction, and there's the Alaska Junction. But if somebody says the Junction, they mean Alaska Street. That's the main business district of West Seattle. Here's the junction back 100 years ago, almost, 1926. This is facing west. And do you see that building in the upper right? That's called the Ham building, H-A-M-M. And we saved that in 2017. We got a landmark. That, you know, with that landmarking, it's unlikely that building will ever go down. But look at the big role. I mean, I realize this is a wide-angle lens, but look at the major role that streetcars play. Houses went up, whole neighborhoods went up, just like today with light rail, where the streetcar was. Now this is the same look at the junction, only it's looking north. And remember the building I pointed out on the right side in the previous photo, that's on the left side. And the Campbell building, which is even older than that, is across the street on the right side there. And we saved that one too. We called these the 2 crown jewels of the junction. These were both landmarked in 2017. And then you can see below that the view of the junction from the same, that's a good now and then comparison there. And you can see the Ham and Campbell buildings there, and why they really provide sort of the showcase and entrance to the Junction Business District. Of course, the streetcar, you can see this embedded in the sidewalks in West Seattle. The streetcar is the symbol. Now, I've been talking about transportation a lot, and I'm just going to let you watch this while I talk for a couple minutes. This is video from the city of Seattle from 1973, and this is the West Seattle Bridge. Most of you know the West Seattle Bridge is a high bridge, but that was the new, and I still call it the new bridge. It was built between 1980 and 1984. This is what was there before. This is the Spokane Street Bridge, and it was 2 spans. One went in 1923, and the other one went in 1930. That's how fast West Seattle was growing in the roaring 20s, that we needed 2 bridges. And the reason I'm showing you this, can you see the bridge creeping up? There's a ship going by. This is looking west, remember, and so north is to the right, and the bridge just kept going up and down all the time, much more so than along your ship canal up here to the north, because the Duwamish River always has been an industrial river. So there's more demand for these large ships to come through, and if you keep, I mean, take a look at that. It's well, it says a lot of things. One thing is that the cars pile up, you know, and you have to wait. And the thing about West Seattle that gave it sort of its isolation is this very factor, that you couldn't really, now if you keep watching closely, you'll see the ship come by. There it is. You couldn't tell anybody how long it would take you to get to downtown from West Seattle, or vice versa. You know, you'd be talking to somebody on the phone saying, well, I'll be there, well, maybe a half hour, maybe an hour. Depends on the bridge, right? So this gives you a good visual idea of what West Seattleites endured, and why West Seattle was really kind of seen as a foreign country. You know, I lived down in Oregon for a dozen years. Went to school in Eugene, and then I worked for the Oregonian newspaper. But I really wanted to get back to Seattle and came back to West Seattle. But for those dozen years, I worked for the Oregonian, and there was another reporter on the Oregonian, Sandy McDonough, who moved up here about the same time I did in '82, and was working for the Seattle Times, and I called her up on the phone. She lived on Queen Anne Hill. And we talked for about 20 minutes. I said, well, it's good to hear your voice. We got to get together sometime. And she says, yeah, next time you're in Seattle. And I said, I am in Seattle. West Seattleites face that all the time. Well, the bridge became a contentious issue. Anybody who's around here in the 70s knows that there was lots of pressure to replace these two low-level, they call them bascule bridges. They still call them that along the ship canal. Bascule is French for teeter-totter. Okay? And, you know, there's one bridge at 4 locations along the ship canal. We had 2, remember? And there was, in the city government, there was a scandal in the 70s, bribery, money laundering, you know, in this effort to try to get a new bridge. I remember Mayor Charlie Royer was quoted. He was the new mayor at the time. He said, well, if we're going to get a new bridge, it's got to be a Ford, not a Cadillac. There were many designs for the bridge. You can read about it in the history book. But people were so frustrated with the bridge in West Seattle that the business community, I mean, this is a big deal. Today we know citizen activists, but in the 70s, for the West Seattle Chamber of Commerce to sponsor this is just mind-blowing. They held a press conference and they announced a campaign for West Seattle to secede from the rest of the city. And they were serious. I mean, they knew it was a good PR move as well. But there were real secession petitions. We print one of them here in the book. It was a big deal, and they, you know, the way you get on the ballot is to, here's the petition on the right side. And the rationale for seceding from Seattle was, if West Seattle seceded from the rest of the city, it would become the 4th largest city in the state. And then West Seattle could go to Olympia and say, the 4th largest city and the largest city need to have a state highway bridge to connect them. That was the rationale. Well, they had gotten half the petition signatures they needed to get it on the ballot. And really what made it a pipe dream is if a part of the city needs to secede, you need to have the whole city vote on it. Well, it would never pass. I mean, what city would get rid of 1/4 of its tax base? I mean, it's nuts. It wouldn't have happened. But they were so fed up with it that the petitions were piling up, thousands and thousands of petitions, until June 11th. Nope, sorry. It was late the night of June 10th, but it was June 11th on a Sunday of 1978. The best pun in West Seattle history occurred. Some of you may know this. It was the night the ship hit the span. Late at night, it was like 2 in the morning, the Chavez freighter, you know, as I showed you in that video, they go up and down the river. It was hauling gypsum to a plant up the Duwamish River. 80-year-old Rolf Neslin was piloting the ship coming this way to the south, and the reports said that he had a 20-second lapse of concentration. People later said that he had been drinking. Anyway, the Chavez listed to the left. Both bridges were up, and the Chavez rammed the south, the east side, the east span, and stuck it open. So instantly, West Seattle went from 8 lanes to 4 lanes, just like that. And this was Monday morning commute, or Monday afternoon commute. You can see the cars going in and out. And this is what triggered the emergency to get the federal funding to build the high-level bridge. Warren Magnuson put in the largest share because he was chair of the Appropriations Committee in Congress. He was our longtime senator. And the city, the port, the county all chipped in their money. And we got a new bridge. And I did this then and now a couple of years ago because, wouldn't you know it, the bridge that was built in 1980 to 84 and was supposed to last twice that long, they found cracks in it and they shut down the bridge for 2 years. So we were again cut off. The thumb was cut off from the hand. You had to drive all the way down to the First Avenue South Bridge, which became a bottleneck, et cetera, et cetera. Here is the special section we did on the bridge in '83. And then here's the t-shirt. You always got to have a t-shirt, right? And notice in this cartoon, our brilliant editorial cartoonist at the Herald, David Kelleher, he's got the new bridge opening, July of '84 when it did. And look at that. The cars are happy, the trucks are happy, the ships are happy. But here's his editorial cartoon for the editorial page. Hold on to your hat, Harold, they've opened the bridge. And sure enough, look at what's coming over the bridge. It's big trucks, there are condos in the back of pickup trucks. And this is a nice pun because we were the West Seattle Herald, right? But this was right about the time when the word yuppie was being coined, and lots of yuppies were moving to West Seattle because of the close commute time. We've just seen, you know, West Seattle used to be behind the rest of the city in terms of property prices, and now property has gone up, the prominence of West Seattle has gone up, and the bridge, again, think about it, transportation. Okay, we're going to go through some things that you can see across the bridge when you visit West Seattle. This is there are a series of log houses here. This is the Log House Museum on Alki. This is the headquarters of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. It's got great museum exhibits. It's just 1 block from Alki Beach. And it was the carriage house for the Alki Homestead, which is this building. And it's a half block from there. It was moved when they put in the street grid. But the carriage house was, you know, it was where you would park your car, or the servants lived upstairs. And this was a rooming house. And then for many years, did anybody eat at the Alki Homestead restaurant? 1, 2, yeah, there's about 5 of you. They were known for their chicken dinners. Here's what it cost to put on a wedding at the Alki Homestead in 1954. Oh, $60, huh? Okay, a little bit south of there is Seaview Hall. That's one of the oldest log buildings as well. There are only a handful of them left in West Seattle. Down below, we'll count this as part of West Seattle, even though it's a couple blocks shy of Roxbury. It's the White Center Fieldhouse. This is built during the WPA times of the Depression. And then moving around West Seattle, this is no more. Luna Park was a big deal. Right when we annexed to Seattle, there's this amusement park that was built out over the water. You could see it from downtown. And today there's just a little park with an anchor replacing it. But it operated, and again, this was private, it operated for only 6 years. It was controversial. I remember a headline in the PI said, 13-year-old girl smoking cigarettes on the bar at Luna Park. You know, it was supposed to be the longest bar in Seattle. And the rides were incredible. You can see the array of them there. But they did great business in the summer, but not so much in the winter. And that's a lot of, you know, the beach kind of business pattern, and it just took it down. But you can get a remnant of it about a mile and a half south at the Luna Park Cafe, which you can see down at the bottom of the slide there. This is a must in the summertime, is to go to the Alki Lighthouse. It was built in 1913, and we were fortunate to have events there when I was director of the Historical Society, because it coincided with the Admiral there opening their home. The Admiral's on the far left. And it's just you cannot appreciate the expanse and the sheer beauty of this site by driving by it, because there's so much that's grown up and the buildings hide the lighthouse from Alki Avenue. Go there when the Coast Guard is giving tours on the weekends in the summertime. Then we got, dear to my heart, the Admiral Theater. The Admiral Theater used to be the Portola. Is there anybody here who's been to the Admiral Theater? Wow, that's terrific. Well, you then know that when you walk into that theater, there's a huge lobby. And then you turn to the right to go see the movies. Well, that huge lobby used to be the movie house. That was the Portola. You walked in, the seats were in front of you, and they projected across the west wall. Well, West Seattle was expanding, and they decided to build the Admiral Theater. In 1942, they did a community contest to name it. They named it the same name as the nearby street. And Carmen Miranda was in Weekend in Havana at the opening night. And this is, you know, here's what it looked like on the inside. I mean, imagine this. Today, a movie theater, this movie theater had 1,000 seats. And then the Art Deco aspect of it, it was built to look like a ship. It had all of this nautical stuff in it. And look up on the ceiling, there were signs of the Zodiac. And people like to sit under their favorite Zodiac sign. And on Thursday night, January 25th, remember how the movie ads used to be in the paper? And they'd say what the ads were. Down at the bottom it said Admiral Theater, closing night, Sunday. This was in 1989, January 1989. And my vice president of the Historical Society, I had just become president of the Historical Society at age 37. And my friend called up on the phone, he said, gee, sounds like somebody should go pick it. And I said, should we? And within 3 days, we got 50 people there. We had all three of our state reps there, 2 state reps and a senator. We had Greg Nichols, our county councilman. He's right in the middle. Georgette Valley's on the left. Greg's wife, Sharon, is on the left. Georgette's on the right. And we picketed. And look at what the name of the film was on the marquee. You couldn't have scripted it better. And we had all 4 TV stations there. Cairo did it live. And You got to see this. Maybe you'll even recognize somebody here. This was on the news late that night.
The last bag of popcorn and the last box of bonbons may have been sold at the Admiral Theater. All indications are that when the movie that's running right now rolls The End, it really will be the end of West Seattle's only movie theater. Tonight, movie patrons protested. The historic Admiral Twin was purchased by the giant movie theater chain Cineplex Odeon out of Toronto, Canada. Protest organizers say they've been told by company officials that the theater will close and that Cineplex Odeon is looking to build a new giant multiplex theater somewhere else in West Seattle. But these theater lovers want to save the 47-year-old movie house. They say the Admiral's nautical theme, from its seafaring name to motif, fits West Seattle.
It was really built to look like a ship, and so it's unique, and it's the kind of a thing that's so big and so different that it's become a landmark.
The protesters hope the city agrees with that and designates the theater as a historical landmark.
In 6 months' time, we collected 4,000 petition signatures. This is not internet. This is standing at Safeway doing that. We sold 1,100 Save the Admiral buttons. Within 6 months, we packed landmark board meetings, and it was David and Goliath. We packed these meetings, and there was this one lawyer for Cineplex Odeon there. I felt sorry for him. The board unanimously made it a landmark, and it's there today. There's a lot more to tell about it, but it's there today. And if you want to support a city landmark I mean, neighborhoods don't have movie theaters anymore. This is, and loving our landmarks was the theme for one of our galas at the historical site. I got to go quickly here. There's a great little bus shelter just kitty corner from the Admiral that's got, look at it, it's a upside down view, you know, north is at the bottom, of West Seattle Peninsula, and it's remarkably accurate, and it's just a gorgeous thing to see. You wouldn't expect this on a bus shelter. There's a great mural along Delridge Way that features the totem pole well, I'm going to get to that quickly. There's the oldest house still standing in Seattle. 1864, this was Doc Maynard's house, and this is how it looks like today. It's on 64th Avenue, down off of Alki, and this is the Now and Then I did on that a 3 years ago, when we were able to obtain 20 letters, handwritten letters of Doc Maynard himself, you know, that had been stored away, pages of it had been stored away between pages of a magazine in a house down in Ceola Beach, in the south end of West Seattle. This is a current cause. Did any of you know this stone house? If you drove around Harbor Avenue, it was there until 2 years ago. It was built in the 30s. There are 15,000 stones covering this. Kids took little red wagons and picked up the beach stones from Alki and hauled them over to this little house, and so they could be stuck on the outside. And we saved it. The developer of the property that wanted to put in a condo building said, you can have it. And they cooperated with us, and we hauled it a mile south, and here's where it is today on Port of Seattle property.
I just think that's a miracle. You know, who would have thought, or anybody think, you know, moving this house and putting it someplace where a lot of people could see how things were, it'll outlast me.
where we would like it to be is between the bathhouse, which you see on the right, and the Statue of Liberty replica on the left. And we're working with the city. We had a very encouraging meeting with the deputy mayor just 2 weeks ago. So, got to have something to work on, and preservation is a big deal. You know, we can't save everything. We don't want to save everything. None of us does. But you got to save the good stuff. So that the crux is, what is the good stuff? And you saw the Alki Statue of Liberty. We're right just a little ways down from that is the Birthplace of Seattle Monument. This commemorates the arrival of the settlers in 1851. This was built in 1905, and a little bit later moved across the street as part of the city park. I led lots of tours of this when I was director of the Historical Society. One little sidelight, if you go up and look at this, go walk Alki, you'll see this. They named the settlers. There were 24 of them. And they named the men, and they named the kids. But the men, after their name, they say, and wife, and wife, and wife. This is 1905. So one of the things we did at the Historical Society, and I don't think you can kind of see in the upper middle photo where the kid is standing right in front of it. Behind that kid's head is a plaque that names the wife's names. This was during the sesquicentennial of 2001. And people like to go and touch this stone. This stone was brought across the country from an auto rally way back when. I did it now and then on the Alki Statue of Liberty replica. It went in 1952, and it was vandalized, and I mean, people would tweak the spikes off of it. Once Lady Liberty's arm was ripped off. I mean, it was really kind of sad. And so there was a community campaign to put a new one up about 15 years ago, and you can see it in the color photo in the middle. And the original one is down there on display at our museum down in the lower left, you can see. Okay, really quickly here, one of the things I really have liked to do over the years is what I've come to call group hugs. If you love a building and want to save it or at least commemorate it, gather a bunch of people and take a photo in front of it. These were, I think they're about 179 if I'm remembering right. These are people who went to Jefferson Elementary School, which got bulldozed the day, or 2 days after this photo was taken. And it's now Jefferson Square, where there's a Safeway and a Bartell's and some apartments. Apparently Jefferson Square may be bulldozed by light rail. We'll see. Another group hug. We invited all the people who who attended Alki Elementary School to come to a reunion. We collaborated with the PTA there, and we got a big group hug photo on the outside of it. If you go to Alki and look at their elementary school today, you won't see this. It's bulldozed. They're building a tall one with no parking, and that's a controversy. Another story. We wanted to save the Alki homestead, 1904. So we did a group hug here, and we've got the mayor, Greg, and Greg's a West Seattle guy, and a number of other people at our July 4th picnic, annual picnic in 2010. But this is 2010. After, it was landmarked. Long story short is it was landmarked. There was a new owner, Doris Nelson, the owner, died, and it was sold by her estate to a man who didn't keep up the restaurant. He kept it operating, but he let it just deteriorate. And so we wanted to make sure to call this to people's attention. Finally, we found a new owner, a buyer for the restaurant. We celebrated that, and look at this. 1,000 people at a group hug in 2015. That's mostly students from Alki and Schmitz Park schools. This is in June, and it made a great field trip for them I mean, you should have seen the sea of kids walking to this. It was amazing. And then this is being shot not by a drone, but on top of a scissor lift truck by my column partner, Jean Sherrard. Another group hug we did at the Admiral Theater. The Admiral, in 1973, they twinned it from the 1,000 seats. In 2016, they cut it into, they made it 4. So we wanted to celebrate that. This is a Junction group hug. This is the centennial of Fauntleroy Elementary School. This is the 100th anniversary of the building of West Seattle High School. There's my mom at West Seattle High School. Okay, and this is the biggest group hug of all when we put up the totem pole that used to be at Belvedere Viewpoint. This is their 1,300 people at this ceremony. And I just want to remind you of the message that's on the outside of the Longhouse. You know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Thank you very much.
Clay, thanks very much. Are there any questions appropriate for the group? 2 questions.
I remember as a very young child riding the trestle, the streetcar across.
It was kind of wobbly, wasn't it?
That was the key thing. I don't remember too much where we were going. I think to one of those little beach houses over there to visit. But I loved the wobbling. Oh, it was great. I'd stand up there and wobble all the way over. So that was great.
You didn't mention Endaline, and tomorrow our group is going to Endaline Joe's for lunch. And when my mother first came to Seattle, she lived at Endaline on the beach. Is that just beyond the ferry?
Endaline is at the south end. If you remember the slide I showed of all the streetcar lines, the one that, the blue one that went all the way down past Lincoln Park, the end of that streetcar line is where the streetcar turned around, and that's why they called it Endoline. And it was a little neighborhood of its own, Endolyne. The restaurant you're talking about has been there about 10, 15 years. It's a great restaurant, but for most of its time, it was a grocery store, mid-level grocery store, serving the Fauntleroy neighborhood. If you know the geography there, that's the little business district, Fauntleroy.
I have a picture of my mother sitting on the beach, and it says at Endaline.
Well,
1931.
Endaline wasn't really on the beach,
Wasn't it?
but because it was up where the streetcar turnaround was. But we'll give it to her. It was close enough.
Well, thank you very much. And Clay, we really appreciate it.
If you have questions, just come on up after. And I want to make sure that you know that I'm giving a copy of the history book to your library. So if you want to learn more about this stuff, it's in here. We've got hundreds of photos in here. It's a great resource.